An important question many of us have faced before is this: what is justice? Perhaps you may have heard of the four cardinal virtues. They are prudence, fortitude, temperance, and justice. The reason why these four virtues are known as cardinal virtues is because they come from the Latin word cardo, which means a hinge, or something primary or essential. In other words, basically, the four main virtues. So when speaking of these four main virtues, we have to reflect on justice, which is one of the four. And when we speak of justice, sometimes we hear of the words equity and fairness and honesty. It's probably true that we all have a concept of what justice means. So before we talk more about justice and what it all entails, I ask you to think about justice, the concept of justice, as we reflect on the parable of the workers in the vineyard, which you will find in the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 20, verses 1 to 16. And I invite you to listen to the very end here, because we will examine the key message which is evident in this very parable. So now, before we analyze this further, it's important to point out that many people who read this parable are quick to point out the seeming injustice that is taking place. That is, the injustice of the landowner who violated workers' rights. Because those workers who worked for more hours should get paid more. And if they don't get paid more, they should sue for justice because the landowner treated them unjustly. You know, you can imagine, for example, the landowner's evil, the landowner's unjust, etc., etc. But hold off on those thoughts for now. We'll examine them later on in this reflection. But, you know, it's a matter of perspective, because on the one hand, it can feel as if the landowner is portraying injustice, but the reality is that's not the case. We'll go on further and explore that later. Now, I want to caution you here. This is not an easy parable to analyze. In fact, it's very hard. You know, the precise reason for this is because this parable can stir a lot of emotion and even anger. But keep in mind, there's more than one point of view we can examine here. And in fact, we should examine the parable from various different points of view to see how it all comes together. So in this parable, there's a landowner who has a vineyard and he needs workers. So he hired the first group starting at dawn and negotiated with them about their fair daily wage. The key point to remember here is this: the agreement to the daily wage. Then the landowner went out at 9 o'clock and hired another group. Then he went out at noon and hired another group. Then at 3 o'clock, did the same thing. Then at 5 o'clock, he did the same thing. Now pay attention to the dialogue with the last group. The landowner asks them why they're not working, and they have a response. So here's what the parable says. Going out at 5 o'clock, the landowner found others standing around and said to them, "Why do you stand here idle all day?" And they answered, "Because no one has hired us." And he said to them, "You too, go into my vineyard." Okay, now continuing on with the story, once the day is over and you cannot work any longer, it's time to pay the employees. It's time to pay these workers. So there's an odd twist here, because the last group who came in to work pretty much worked for like an hour or so, and they're paid first. And they were paid the same amount as the first group, who, as the parable says, bore the day's burden and heat. And so some who came first, you know, the very first group, they thought they would receive more, but that was not the case. And so what happens in the parable? Well, they started grumbling, right? They said, well, why aren't we paid more? They feel as if they deserve more because they did more of the work. And now pay attention to the response of the landowner. The landowner says this: "Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what is yours and go. What if I wish to give this last one the same as you? Or am I not free to do as I wish with my own money? Are you envious because I am generous?" Okay, so let's just pause right here for a moment. Now, if this landowner was a real person today, and depending on the country where the landowner is from, let's say in the USA, for example, he'll likely be sued for unjust treatment of workers, right? In fact, many people who read this parable, that's how they sort of feel. They sort of feel like a sense of injustice. But focus on the story, and more importantly, on the message of this parable. What is it trying to address? And so you see, one interpretation, perhaps one which is popular for this parable, is as follows. The workers who accept the invitation to work in the vineyard, they represent those working to enter the kingdom of heaven. No matter how late in the day, no matter how late in their life, they work and follow Jesus. And they will receive the reward that's equal to those who have been faithful the longest, right? Those who've been faithful since the very beginning, and those who've been faithful, like later on in their lives. And as I mentioned, this is a popular interpretation. However, there's also a fair amount of criticism regarding this interpretation. For example, if what we just mentioned is the case, namely, like if you follow Jesus from the beginning, first as the last minute, you get the same thing. Well, if that's the case, then some people would say, well, why don't I just go enjoy my life before I die? Why don't I just go do all these crazy things I've always wanted to do, and then I'll be fine. And then just right before I die, then I convert and then go to heaven. That's one of the mindsets I hear from time to time. But keep this in mind. Genuine faithfulness is required here. It's impossible to calculate the grace that God gives to each individual person. It's about remaining faithful to the Lord, even if it's earlier in your life or later on in your life. And besides, we just don't know when we're going to die. And so let's move on for a moment to another important aspect of the interpretation of this parable. We read about the usual daily wage, which is mentioned in the gospel reading. And the daily wage is considered a denarius during the time of Jesus, which is a silver coin. It's the usual daily wage for a day laborer. And that's the coin that's sufficient for the laborer to sustain a living, right? To provide for his family, etc. Now, take a look at this parable again. Some begin work at dawn, right? At the very beginning, others later on. And then at the end of the day, they all get paid the same amount. Now, if you look at it in this context, there is generosity from the viewpoint of the landowner, because he wants to be able to provide for the daily need of not just the first group that came in that agree with him with the usual daily wage, but then also the last group that came in that need the payment, the denarius, to sustain their day, right? To sustain their whole day. And so, there is precedence regarding this in the Old Testament. I want to direct your attention, for example, to Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 14 to 15. Here's what it says. You shall not exploit a poor and needy hired servant, whether one of your own kindred or one of the resident aliens who live in your land within your gates. On each day you shall pay the servant's wages before the sun goes down, since the servant is poor and is counting on them. Otherwise, the servant will cry to the Lord against you, and you will be held guilty. Now, the parable has often been interpreted to mean that even those who are converted later in life, they receive the equal reward along with those converted early. And again, the parable can be interpreted as showing that the people hired early in the day felt envious, felt jealous of the other workers, even though they would have been satisfied had they known about the group that was hired later. Right? And so we'll explore this in a little bit later. But from this point here, I want to just talk a little bit about perspective. Take a look at the perspective of the landowner. He asked the question, are you envious because I am generous? And that's one of the questions that we have to reflect upon in our own lives too, right? Like when we read this parable, how do we feel? Do we feel envious because the landowner is generous. He's giving everyone, the denarius, what is required for living. It's difficult, right? Like at times for people to experience this, and they reflect on it and they say, well, there's really no sense of justice. And so if you take a look though at a different perspective, that is the perspective of the landowner, it's about generosity. Right? If you take a look at the perspective of the laborer, sometimes, we look at it and say, oh, well, feel bad for the first group. At least they should get something more, right? But, that's the perspective of labor. And then, of course, too, the perspective of the outside observer. Some would say, you have to pay those who came in first a little bit more. Some say, no, not the case. But here's the thing. Today, in the world today, there is this sense of like feeling entitled to everything, right? That, we don't have to do anything. We'll just sit back, relax until towards the very end, and we'll do just that small bit of work, and then we should just get paid the whole amount. Sometimes, when we think that way, that's one way to calculate costs, right, from an economic perspective. But here, this parable is much deeper than this. And so now I want to draw your attention to an interpretation, one that really helps us to go deeper in this parable and to interiorize. Now, in this story, the landowner hired the first set of workers at dawn, early in the morning. And these workers, as you can imagine, the ones who started at the beginning, they count themselves lucky because they were hired. They were chosen over others who were not hired. Now, thing is, the landowner did not just hire the first group, also hired the second group, the third group, like those who came later, et cetera, right? And so if we pay attention to this, we see that then later on, the landowner hired, more people. And here's the question that we have to reflect upon. What if the very first group, the group that started at dawn, did not know about the group that came in later? Or what if the landowner decides not to hire the group that came in later? My question is to you is this: would the first group be satisfied? Think about that for a moment. The answer is yes, right? They'd be happy because they were hired, they get to work the whole day, and then they get paid the daily wage, right? But then wait, they know that others came in later, and they know that these who came in later did less work. And so then they start grumbling and saying, well, I should get more because I do more work, etc. Right? And like I share, in a modern context today, and especially depending on certain countries, it can get very, very complicated, right? But keep in mind, this is a parable. And if we contextualize everything, we try to really reflect on this parable and how it applies to the kingdom of God, then things begin to make sense. You see, so oftentimes we focus on others. We focus on, well, how come I have to do so much work? How come that guy doesn't do as much work? And when we try to reason it like that, then we end up becoming resentful. We end up feeling jealous, etc. Like in the gospel reading, right? And so when these things happen, then it becomes problematic. And so then ultimately reflect on this very point. And this very point is simply this: if the first group did not know about the group that came in later, or let's just say, for example, if the landowner did not hire those other laborers who came in later, would the first group be happy? And as we mentioned, the answer is yes. And so if that's the case, then why are they grumbling? Why are they angry? Well, because they're focusing on the wrong thing. They're focusing on the wrong thing. And in our own lives too, sometimes it's important for us to focus on the right thing, not on the wrong thing, right? The wrong thing would be comparing ourselves to others. The wrong thing would be saying, well, you know what? My neighbor just got a nice car, so I'm going to go get a nice car too, but one nicer than him because I have to outdo him or her, right? And when we keep thinking about comparing, and when they have more than we do, and we feel bad and we say, well, I feel so bad, I deserve more, etc., then it becomes a problem. But here, if we put it in the context of the kingdom of heaven, keep this point in mind. God always calls us, and he's always on a journey with us. Whether, we begin the journey young in our lives or later, the Lord's always there to guide us and to lead us and to help us, right? To grow into to become more like him, right? On our journey to heaven. That's ultimately what this parable is about. It's about this revelation of the landowner and the workers, how these workers are really working towards entering into the kingdom of heaven. May God bless you.